Well, hello everyone. This is Pastor Dirk with our first devotional in the series, Why the Cross? And if you were with us on Sunday, you saw that we were focusing on the problem that God is solving in the cross. And we concluded, if you look at all the problems in the world, if you go to the core underneath all of it, you find one basic problem, that we're all wrong. We do the wrong things for the wrong reasons in the wrong way, and we do it over and over again. We have a bunch of people that for centuries have been doing the wrong things. It creates the mess in which we're now living. So God has a big mess to clean up in the cross. And we focused on the fact that sometimes we religious people, we don't get that. We're out there drawing lines in the world and judging other people and telling them they're wrong. Meanwhile, we're not facing the truth that we're wrong and that God should be changing us. And towards the end of our talk, I just said briefly that I realize, of course, as we enter into the world, there are times where we're going to have to tell the world that it's wrong. We have to disagree with policies and practices and behaviors that destroy and hurt other people. We need to speak for those who are being hurt. So when we're telling ourselves, or when we're reading that we should not be judging, we want to be careful what we mean. We do have to speak for what's right, but we have to be careful how we speak for what's right. And I wanted to expand on that theme a little bit today through another passage in Scripture. Jesus actually addresses this subject in his Sermon on the Mount. And I want to look at the first few verses in Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus tackles this subject of judging. And he starts very simply by saying in Matthew 7 verse 1, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." It's been a very controversial verse over the years. What is Jesus really telling us here when he tells us not to judge, or we will be judged? Some people have interpreted this to mean, well, you cannot really judge anyone. You cannot really say anyone is wrong. And I would say that that's not really the context here. If we understand this word judge as it's used in Matthew especially, it has a very specific meaning. It's talking about a divine judgment. Sometimes, often in our court cases today, there's kind of various phases of judgment, isn't there? Sometimes there's the pronouncing of guilty or innocent, where the jury makes the decision, and then later there is this imposition of the sentence. What will be the penalty for being pronounced guilty? This particular word, as it's used in Matthew and as Jesus uses it here, it's talking about the penalty. The fact of whether someone's guilty or not guilty, that's established. Let's assume they're guilty. The question is, what about the penalty? What is the penalty to be paid if one is guilty and if one is wrong? And what Jesus is telling his followers here is, be careful how you decide what the penalty is. Be careful how you're making the decision about the price someone should pay for their being wrong, for their making a mistake. And he's warning us that the same penalty that you apply, the same standard you use to apply that penalty, will be the standard that will be applied to you. Look how he expands that thought in verse 2. He says, "For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." The image there is a kind of a marketing image. In the days where they're weighing grain or weighing gold in order to be paid, the idea is that the same scale should be used so that the differences are not, the payment is equitable. The idea here is, if someone sins against us and does something against us, and we demand that they receive the fullest extent of the law, as much punishment as we can dish out, we're going to demand it from them. That's the measurement that we're going to use, that scale that says, you violated my space, therefore you deserve all the punishment that you can possibly get. What Jesus is saying, do you understand that if you live that way, then you're going to get what you give? You're going to be treated the same way. You're going to have to pay the same payment when we violate other spaces. I think Jesus is getting to the fact here and getting to the basic problem here of ignoring the function of grace. If we don't have grace in our lives, if we're constantly holding other people to a standard of perfection, that they must do everything the way we want them to do, and we don't have that grace built in, then how is grace going to be applied to us? What we're really doing, if we live in a world or if we expect things from others and we hold them to this high perfectionistic pure standard, what we're really showing is we don't understand grace. We've never experienced grace. We're still living in a world that we have to prove ourselves, that we have to be perfect. But what Jesus is saying is we're not perfect. We don't live up to that standard. We don't hold on to that. Look at how he expands this thought here as he proceeds. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" He uses this exaggerated image. I mean, we really can't imagine this image of someone with a plank in their eye. But he's using this stark image to make a point. That sometimes in our zeal to judge other people, we're not missing the fact that we have a problem ourselves. We get so obsessed about someone else's problems that we're not conscious of the fact that we have a problem. I think all of us have been in relationships where someone lies to us or someone betrays us and we get very upset. We've all been in those places where we lie in bed at night thinking about the things that ought to be done to that person that hurt us. And yet, for some reason, we don't have that same compulsion about ourselves. You know, I think it was Leo Tolstoy who said that everybody talks about changing the world, but few people talk about changing themselves. We have this exaggerated lens by which we sense when people step on us and transgress our space and make us uncomfortable, but we don't have that same degree of heightened sensitivity when it comes to what we do to other people. And Jesus is saying very simply here, before we are out there telling the world where it is wrong, we should be very, very sensitive about what is wrong with us. Otherwise, we're missing this whole point of grace. It's showing us that we haven't experienced grace the way we should. And he takes this image now a step deeper when he says, how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? So the first question he asks has to do with being aware, not realizing that we have problems ourselves, that we haven't experienced grace. And now he turns and pushes that outwards and he says, how can you help another person then? How can we help another person get better if we haven't experienced grace ourselves? How can we go out into a world that's enslaved to sin, enslaved to addiction, if we've never been delivered from our own sin or our own addictions, if we've never experienced the power of grace in our life? It's hard to go out into the world and teach somebody to recover from something we've never had. We try to speak truth into their lives, but when it comes to this area of sin, until we've fought that, until we've experienced God's delivering grace, how is it that we're going to go and help someone else get that addiction out of their life or get that pain out of their life, the way that they're just addicted to hurting other people and hurting themselves? Unless we've experienced the deliverance of God, how can we help another person? Now, I realize sometimes we will not have done what they did. We didn't take drugs or whatever it is we're trying to help them with. But we have faced the sin in our life. We've acknowledged the sin in our life, and we've experienced God's powerful, healing, forgiving grace. That's what we can take to them. And that's really what God is recommending that we do in this world. Notice he says, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." The idea of the hypocrite there, that's an actor word. That means we're playing a role, we're pretending. And I suppose we've all known people that kind of use their religion as an identity thing. I mean, they aren't really convinced, they're not transformed, They're just kind of using their church and their place in their church as a role. It's a way for them to identify themselves in the world, a space in which they can be taken seriously. And we've seen those people, and most of us can kind of tell when those people are faking it. They're playing a role. Jesus calls these people hypocrites. The goal here is not to fake it, not to pretend like we can tell the truth when we haven't experienced the truth, when we haven't experienced the healing grace of God in our lives. He's saying, until we've experienced that healing grace ourselves, how can we go out into a world and tell them where they are wrong? So I don't think Jesus is telling us here in this passage, don't go tell the world when they're wrong. He's not saying they're innocent. He's not saying believe whatever you want. Everybody's right. You can't judge anybody. No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying before we go out into the world and express our opinion and express truth, we have to have experienced it ourselves. We have to have been transformed by God's grace, because ultimately it's God's grace that's going to heal them, not us spouting things off. Which brings us to verse 6. Now, sometimes we're not always sure. Scholars debate whether this verse should be included, whether this is part of the context or this starts a separate truth. But I tend to think it follows on. It's a kind of a natural consequence of what Jesus has just said. He says in verse 6, he says, do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Well, not a very, very pleasant picture, is it, of pigs turning on us. And I don't know if you've ever been in a place where you've seen kind of wild boars out there. They can be nasty animals sometimes with their huge tusks and all the rest. So it's not a very attractive picture here of pigs attacking us. And it's not a very complimentary picture, even in a Jewish world, especially in a Jewish world. But I think it's a powerful point. When we go out into the world that doesn't know the difference between right and wrong, and if we just go out there in the world and all we do is keep pointing our fingers and telling them how wrong they are, how do we think that's going to change them? Aren't we just going to get attacked? And we see that now. Sometimes our methodologies of going out the world and just telling them how wrong they are, all we do is get ourselves attacked, because there's too deep a void between them and what they see as right. How are they going to see they are wrong? God hasn't revealed to them the error of their ways. And so we get attacked. How about if the way that we change the world around us is through this message of grace? How about rather than standing on one side of the wall and just continually pointing our fingers and screaming about the truth, if we lovingly, caringly speak about God's grace and God's love to them? Yes, we will have to protest. We will have to sign letters. We will have to vote. We will have to express our opinions. Yes, we want to stand up for what's right. But what if we found ways to do that in peace? What if we found ways to do that with respect? What if we did it as people who have experienced Christ's healing grace ourselves, that we've faced the demons in our own life, we've faced the things that are wrong in our souls, and we've experienced the power of grace? Because grace is the thing that's going to change them. Love is the thing that's going to change them. We shouldn't be surprised when we go out there and we're attacked for what we believe. No, that's going to happen. But we should be wise in how we handle all this. We should be wise in how we dialogue with our culture. Because the end game is not for us to prove us right and them wrong. God has already made that decision who's right and wrong. No, the goal is for them to see that there is a right through grace, that God can rescue and redeem. And the best way we can make that point is when God changes us and makes us into different people. So that as people look at the way we talk about truth and the way we care for people and the way that we respect everyone's point of view, even if we don't agree, if people can see that, then they can begin to ask questions about who's the God beyond all this? Who's the God who they worship? Who's this God that teaches them how to live? And maybe ears would open, they'd be willing to listen to another point of view. I think that's what Jesus is telling us right here. He's telling us before we rush to condemn those outside of ourselves, can we experience the power of grace, the transforming power of grace, and then become that kind of presence in the world? We will have a greater impact, I'm sure. Well, I hope these few thoughts have added some perspective to some of the comments we made on Sunday. And don't forget to come back this week. We're going to do part 2 of Why the Cross and talk about how God addresses this problem of sin, this wrongness in our world, and how he makes us right. So again, we meet online and in person at 8:30 and again on 10. So we'll see you on Sunday.